Most people misunderstand the breaking point of an empath because they are looking for something dramatic, something visible, something they can point to and say, that's when it happened. But for the empath, it never happens like that. It doesn't arrive as a loud moment. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, almost invisibly, layer by layer, interaction by interaction, until what looks like a sudden shift is actually the final stage of something that has been forming for a very long time. He is the kind of person who doesn't react the way people expect, not because he doesn't feel, but because he feels too much to respond impulsively. So when something feels off, when a tone changes slightly, when a comment carries a subtle edge, he doesn't push back immediately. He pauses, not externally, but internally. And in that pause, something begins. He starts analyzing, not in a cold or calculated way, but in a way that tries to preserve meaning, tries to protect the connection, tries to make sense of what just happened, without immediately turning it into conflict. You might see him smile through something that didn't sit right. You might hear him say, "It's probably nothing," or "Maybe they didn't mean it like that." And from the outside, it looks like patience. It looks like emotional control. It looks like strength. But inside, it is something far more complex. It is a constant negotiation between what he felt and what he believes the other person deserves. And more often than not, he gives the benefit of the doubt away faster than he gives himself validation. There was a moment I remember clearly. Someone sat across from him and made a comment that was just slightly off, not enough to start an argument, but enough to create a shift, and he noticed it instantly. His eyes changed for a fraction of a second. But then he leaned forward instead of pulling back. He asked more questions instead of setting a boundary. He tried to understand instead of confronting, and the conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. But that moment didn't disappear. It didn't dissolve. It stayed, stored somewhere beneath the surface, where these things quietly accumulate. That is the part most people never see. Because the empath does not express pain in real time, he processes it. He absorbs it. He files it away. Not as a grudge, but as information. Every inconsistency, every moment of being overlooked, every time effort wasn't returned in the same way it was given, nothing is ignored, even if nothing is said. And over time, this creates a hidden weight, one that doesn't show in his behavior immediately, but changes how he perceives everything that follows. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because people assume that if there is no reaction, there is no impact. They assume that silence means acceptance, that calmness means comfort. But what if that silence is actually the space where everything is being recorded, where every detail is being measured, where every pattern is slowly taking shape, unnoticed by everyone except the one person living inside it? The empath doesn't break when something happens. He doesn't reach his limit in a single moment. He reaches it when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. When all the small things he chose not to react to begin to align into something undeniable, something that no longer needs interpretation, something that no longer leaves room for doubt. And by the time anyone else notices a change in him, by the time they feel the distance, or the silence, or the shift in energy, what they are actually seeing is not the beginning of the break. It is the end of a process that has already finished. They don't break when it happens. They break when they realize it never really stopped. What looks like patience from the outside is rarely just patience for an empath. It is a constant internal negotiation that never fully turns off, a quiet process where every feeling is weighed against meaning, where every moment of discomfort is filtered through understanding before it is ever allowed to become reaction. He doesn't ignore what he feels, he reinterprets it. And that difference is subtle but critical, because instead of asking, "Why did that hurt?" he asks, "What might have caused them to act that way?" And in that shift, his attention moves away from himself and toward the other person, not out of weakness, but out of habit, a habit built on the belief that connection is something worth preserving. Even at a personal cost, he hasn't fully calculated yet. There is a pattern you begin to notice if you watch closely enough. He will defend people who are not in the room. He will soften statements that felt sharper than they should have been. He will translate cold behavior into stress, inconsistency into complexity, distance into something temporary. And each time he does this, he is not lying to himself. He is trying to maintain coherence in a reality that no longer feels consistent, because admitting the truth too early would require a decision he is not ready to make. I once saw someone sit in a conversation where the imbalance was obvious to everyone except the person inside it. They were the one asking the questions, the one adjusting their tone, the one trying to keep the interaction smooth, while the other person offered very little in return, and when it was over, they didn't complain. They explained it. "They've just been under a lot of pressure lately," as if that explanation could somehow equalize what had just happened. As if understanding could substitute for reciprocity. This is where endurance begins to blur into something else, something less visible and far more dangerous, because endurance, when it is conscious, has a boundary. It knows when to stop. But when that boundary is repeatedly crossed without consequence, endurance stretches into tolerance. And tolerance, when pushed too far, quietly becomes self-abandonment. He doesn't notice the exact moment it happens. No one does. There is no clear line, no single decision, just a gradual shift where staying is no longer a choice but an obligation, where leaving feels heavier than enduring, not because the situation deserves it, but because he has already invested so much of himself into making it work that walking away feels like losing something meaningful, even if what he is holding on to has already started to diminish. And so he gives more, not less. He becomes clearer, more patient, more available. He communicates better, explains deeper, tries harder to close the gap that keeps widening, believing that if he can just get it right, if he can just express it in the right way, things will finally align. But what he doesn't see yet is that he is the only one adjusting, the only one compensating, the only one trying to stabilize something that was never balanced to begin with. From the outside, this looks admirable. It looks like loyalty, like emotional intelligence, like strength under pressure, but internally, something is being traded away piece by piece. Every time he overrides what he feels in order to protect what he hopes is still there, he is teaching himself that his own signals are negotiable, that discomfort can be postponed, that clarity can wait. And over time, that negotiation becomes automatic, so automatic that he no longer questions it. He simply continues explaining, continues understanding, continues staying, even when a quieter question has already begun forming somewhere deeper beneath the surface. So at what point does understanding someone quietly turn into abandoning yourself? At first, it never looks like a pattern. It looks like isolated moments. Small inconsistencies that can be explained away, softened, reframed into something that feels manageable, and that is exactly why they are so easy to tolerate, because each moment on its own does not seem significant enough to challenge, not strong enough to justify a boundary, not clear enough to confront without feeling like you might be overreacting. He notices them. Of course he does. But noticing is not the same as acting. And in the beginning, he still believes that context matters more than conclusion. So when effort is not returned, he assumes timing is off. When attention fades, he assumes something else is demanding it. When care feels one-sided, he tells himself it will rebalance. And each time he does this, he resets the emotional equation instead of solving it. But repetition has a way of removing ambiguity, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, then all at once, because what was once an exception begins to show up as a rhythm. What was once a misunderstanding starts to look familiar, and what was once forgivable becomes predictable, not because anything new is happening, but because the same thing is happening again, just in slightly different forms. There is a point where memory stops being passive and becomes comparative, where he is no longer just experiencing the present moment, but subconsciously placing it next to everything that came before it. And in that comparison, something shifts. Not emotionally, but structurally, the pieces start to align. The tone, the behavior, the timing, the lack of reciprocity, none of it feels random anymore. I've seen this happen in ways that don't look dramatic from the outside. A person checking their phone after sending a message that took effort, noticing that the response, when it finally comes, feels distant, minimal, almost obligatory, and instead of reacting, they pause. Not because they are unsure, but because something in them is quietly confirming what they have already felt before, and in that moment, the question is no longer, what happened, but why does this feel so familiar? That familiarity is where clarity begins to form, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual collapse of alternative explanations, because there are only so many times you can reinterpret the same behavior before the interpretation itself starts to feel dishonest. And once that happens, the emotional fog that once protected the connection begins to lift, revealing something far less comfortable, but far more accurate. The imbalance becomes visible in a way that cannot be ignored. He starts to see that effort has not been mutual, that attention has not been consistent, that the weight of maintaining the connection has been carried disproportionately, and more importantly, that this was never a temporary phase waiting to correct itself. It was a stable dynamic that had been reinforced over time. This is where the internal shift becomes irreversible, not because of a single event, but because of accumulated evidence. Because clarity does not come from intensity, it comes from repetition. And once the pattern is seen clearly, it no longer requires emotional interpretation. It simply is, and when that moment arrives, it doesn't feel like anger. It doesn't feel like heartbreak. It feels quieter than that, almost unsettling in its stillness. Because what replaces confusion is not pain, but certainty, and certainty removes the need to keep questioning what you already understand. And suddenly, it's no longer confusing. It's just clear. When clarity settles in, something subtle but irreversible begins to change. Not in what he feels, but in how he allows those feelings to move. Because for a long time, his emotional system operated in real time, responding, adjusting, interpreting. constantly staying engaged with every shift in tone and behavior. But once the pattern becomes undeniable, that automatic engagement starts to slow down, and eventually, it stops being automatic at all. He is still aware, still perceptive, still able to read between the lines with the same precision. But the difference now is that awareness no longer leads directly to action. There is a pause where there used to be immediacy, a space where something new begins to form, and in that space, he is no longer asking how to fix what he sees. He is deciding whether it deserves a response in the first place. This is the part that confuses people the most, because from the outside, it looks like distance, like disinterest, like something has been withdrawn. But what has actually been removed is not care. It is access, the automatic kind that once allowed others to reach him emotionally without resistance, without structure, without having to meet him at the same level of consistency he was offering them. There was a time when he would explain everything, when silence in a conversation felt like something that needed to be filled, when tension felt like something that had to be resolved immediately. And he would step in, adjust his tone, clarify his intention, soften the moment before it had a chance to harden into conflict. But now, when that same silence appears, he lets it exist, not as avoidance, but as observation, because not every gap needs to be closed, and not every misunderstanding needs to be repaired by the same person every time. I once watched someone go from being the emotional center of every interaction to becoming almost still, not withdrawn in a defensive way, but grounded in a way that made their presence feel different. They no longer rushed to respond, no longer over-explained, no longer carried the weight of making sure everything stayed balanced. And what stood out was not what they were doing, but what they had stopped doing, because in that absence, you could see how much they had been compensating before. This is what emotional detachment actually looks like for an empath. It is not the absence of feeling. It is the removal of automatic access. It is the shift from reacting to evaluating, from absorbing to observing, from being pulled into every emotional current to choosing when and where to engage. And that choice changes everything, because it restores something that had been quietly lost in the process of overgiving: control over their own emotional energy. He no longer feels the urgency to fix what feels off. He no longer translates inconsistency into something acceptable just to maintain connection. And most importantly, he no longer offers the same level of emotional availability to patterns that have already proven themselves unstable, not out of punishment, but out of recognition, because once you see something clearly, continuing to engage with it in the same way becomes a decision, not a default. To others, this shift can feel like something is missing, like the version of him they were used to has faded, the one who would always respond, always understand, always adjust. But what they are actually experiencing is the absence of overcompensation, the removal of a system that once kept everything functioning despite the imbalance. And without it, the dynamic reveals itself for what it has always been. He is still there, still present, still aware, but no longer available in the same way, no longer immediately responsive to every emotional signal, no longer carrying both sides of an interaction without question. And in that change, something stabilizes internally, something that does not depend on how others show up. To everyone else, it feels like distance, but to him, it finally feels like alignment. What comes after detachment is often mistaken for emptiness, as if something has been lost or shut down. But for him, It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like structure beginning to form where there was once only reaction, because for the first time, he is no longer organizing himself around other people's behavior. He is organizing himself around clarity, and that shift changes not just how he responds, but how he decides who and what even reaches him in the first place. Before this, boundaries were something he considered in moments of discomfort, something he thought about after something had already gone too far. But now they begin to take on a different role, not reactive, not defensive, but preventative, less about stopping pain once it happens, and more about recognizing early signs before emotional investment deepens. And that recognition becomes the new filter through which every interaction passes. He doesn't ask how to make it work anymore. He asks something far more direct, something that would have felt too cold to consider before. Does this deserve access to me at all? And that question is not asked out of judgment, but out of respect for what it has cost him to reach this point. Because once you have seen what happens when access is given without structure, you no longer treat your presence as something that should be automatically available. There is a noticeable shift in his behavior. Not dramatic, not announced, but consistent. He no longer explains his limits in long conversations. He no longer feels the need to justify why something doesn't feel right. He simply adjusts his level of engagement, steps back when patterns repeat, and allows his actions to communicate what words used to carry, because he has learned that boundaries are not defined by what you say, but by what you consistently allow. I've seen this in people who used to stay in conversations far longer than they should have, who used to give multiple chances without ever changing the terms of access. And then something shifts. They begin leaving earlier, responding less, investing only where effort is returned. And from the outside, it can look like they have become distant or selective, but internally, it is something much more stable. They are no longer negotiating against their own intuition just to maintain connection. This is where self-respect stops being an idea and becomes behavior, because it is easy to say you value yourself, but it is much harder to act in alignment with that value when it requires you to reduce access, to walk away from what is familiar, to stop investing where there is no return. And yet, once that alignment begins, something settles internally, a kind of consistency that was never possible when he was constantly overriding what he felt. He no longer measures connection by intensity. He measures it by consistency, by reciprocity, by whether the emotional space feels mutual rather than managed. And when it doesn't, he does not try to fix it. He simply chooses not to stay in it the same way. Not out of indifference, but out of understanding, because connection without balance is not depth. It is dependency disguised as meaning. What others interpret as distance is often just the absence of overextension, the removal of effort that was never meant to be one-sided. And without that extra effort, the truth of the dynamic becomes visible, not because he exposed it, but because he stopped covering for it. And in that space, there is no need for confrontation, no need for explanation, because behavior already reflects the decision. He is not colder, not closed, not disconnected. He is simply no longer available in ways that require him to lose himself to maintain someone else's presence. And that difference, while subtle, changes everything about how he moves through the world, because now every connection begins with awareness instead of assumption. They didn't become someone new. They just stopped being someone they had to survive as.